Hi, my name is Amanda Held, and welcome to our very first episode of Service After Sacrifice.
And I'm Ryan Pickett, and we are with a special guest today, Haraz Ghanbari from Perrysburg, Ohio. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Haraz Ghanbari. I live in Perrysburg, Ohio, which is a suburb of Toledo, Ohio, just about 1 hour south of Detroit, just down 75. My wife and I moved back to Ohio after spending about 7.5 years in Northern Virginia. I was a photojournalist in the White House press corps, traveled the world aboard Air Force One with 2 presidents and covered 2 secretaries of defense and traveled the Secretary of State. That was an opportunity to really kind of have a front row seat to history, from the political scene to pro sports to kind of everything that makes our nation and our world go round. The center of that really kind of occurs in Washington, D.C. on a daily basis. So I enlisted in the Army National Guard when I was 17 years old. I was a 17-year-old high school senior, grew up outside of Cleveland in a small town, Bay Village, Ohio. I went off to basic training in AIT, and then I went back to Kent State and I started studying photojournalism. I did a deployment in Bosnia shortly after September 11th, 2001. We were actually in Fort Dix, New Jersey, getting our cold weather gear from the Central Issue facility when the plane struck the towers. And
Wow.
I remember the first sergeant just kind of bringing us all outside, and we huddled around a small minivan and listened to everything kind of unfold on the radio. And I remember thinking to myself, well, here we go. This is a day that our world's going to be changed yet again. You know, yesterday we look back on Pearl Harbor and the events that unfolded that day that changed the world. And some people have said that September 11, 2001 kind of is this generation's Pearl Harbor. So a lot of women and a lot of men had their lives turned upside down on that day, families that were broken apart. And so many of our fellow comrades, you know, when the question was asked, whom shall I send and who will go for us? They willingly raised their hands, deployed overseas to a land far from their own family and friends. And here we are, 2018, 17 years later, we are still in sustained combat operations around the world right now. So I went off to Bosnia, came back, finished up my degree, and then I got hired at the Associated Press at 23 years old as their youngest AP staff photographer in the White House press corps. And during that time, I was going back overseas with either the president or the Secretary of Defense. We would go back to places like Iraq and Kosovo and Afghanistan. And I kind of thought to myself, here I am in my kind of late 20s now, out of the military, finished up my time as an Army sergeant. But I felt I had more to give my country. And so I was recommended for a direct commission into the U.S. Navy, was accepted for that commission, received my commissioning in the Oval Office by the President of the United States. At the time was President Obama. He swore me in and pinned my rank, and I immediately had volunteered to go to Afghanistan. So Christmas Eve of 10, I landed in Afghanistan, was there through July of 11, attached to the Army's 10th Mountain Division as a public affairs officer. So I was in charge of all of the imagery in southern Afghanistan. And when I came back from that deployment, I had a similar feeling of when I came back from Bosnia, kind of like, where have I been? Where am I going, and how am I going to get there? And I just saw so many of our fellow veterans struggling in that transition, whether it be the service member or the family member or someone that was active duty, guard, or reserve. It didn't matter. I just saw kind of a common theme that there's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy that our service men and women have to kind of cut through, when they come back, and who's going to be their advocate, and who's going to put their hand around them and say, hey, walk with me. I can help you through this. So I left my job at the Associated Press to move back to Ohio. I've spent the last 6 years working in higher education, helping those same type of folks transition from military service to the classroom and beyond. 2017, I ran for city council in Perrysburg, Ohio. I was elected. I've been a member of council since the first of this year. And it's just been a real honor and a privilege not only to serve at the local level here in Perrysburg, but serve my country, as a commissioned naval officer.
Wow.
Well, it's an honor for us to have you.
Well, I appreciate you having me. I think
so
the work that you guys are doing with veterans, those veterans that are struggling with things like post-traumatic stress and other kind of invisible wounds is really important, because at the end of the day, it's folks from middle America, places like Perrysburg, Ohio, or Monclova Township, or White House, Ohio, or anywhere, in between, that don't have big, prominent military installations nearby that can help those women and can help those men transition. And so, I would say that our community is very fortunate to have an organization such as Hoofs here being impactful in the lives of these veterans. And frankly, you may not know the impact that you're having in their lives, but you're planting a seed for their recovery. Absolutely. And it might be 5 or 10 or 15 years from now where you will see, some shift, and maybe that veteran will come back. And I'm sure you've already had some veterans that have come back and have already said in the short time they've been affiliated with you, it's been impactful. So I just appreciate what you guys are doing, from one veteran, to another.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That's one of the reasons that we really wanted to start this podcast, because we feel like we're seeing a pattern in all of the veterans that come through where they had a time of struggle, and from that struggle they saw a void, and then they came up with a solution to fill that void, and now they're of service to humanity. And one of the things I wanted to touch on in your story a little bit is you mentioned that you had gotten out of the Army, and you were kind of struggling with that, not being affiliated with the military. So can you tell us a little bit more about that time for you and what that was like?
Well, I think, in the military, there's a sense of camaraderie. So today's the Army-Navy game. Here's a game that everybody who has suited up to play that game today is prepared to give their lives in defense of this nation and for everyone that is watching it. My time in the military, when I enlisted in the Army Guard, I enlisted in 1999. So, our country wasn't, at war, at the time, per se. I think that people have different catalysts that prompt them to want to serve. For some folks, it's a sense of responsibility, or it's a sense of family lineage. For some folks, they're trying to find a way to maybe pay for their college education, or, to give back on a full-time basis or give back on a part-time basis. For me, at the end of the day, it was about service to a cause bigger than my own. My father is an immigrant to this country from Iran. He was a chief petty officer in the Shah's Navy. My grandparents on my American side had all served in the military. My wife's grandparents and some of her uncles and aunts had served in the military, the same as some of my uncles and my aunts and my cousins. So part of that was, just growing up and seeing that sense of sacrifice and dedication. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the political party is that is making the decisions, either at the White House or up on the Hill or in the Senate. It's about knowing that you've raised your right hand to defend a cause much greater than any single individual. And, being in DC and covering a lot of funerals at Arlington National Cemetery, I have the great privilege of being one of the military journalists to photograph for a book called Where Valor Rests. And Where Valor Rests documents Arlington National Cemetery for 1 full year from Memorial Day to Memorial Day. And so every active duty death that results in a burial at Arlington National Cemetery, the families, the next of kin, receives a copy of this kind of coffee-sized table book that documents everything from the wildlife to the tomb guards to the Arlington ladies to the caisson platoons to the rifle details. It documents absolutely everything. And just the amount of time that I spent at Arlington, I just thought, I've got something more to give my country. There are stories that are not being told of our men and our women in uniform, day in and day out, going out on missions. Sometimes you would hear about it on the news. Here it is in 2018. When's the last time that you or your viewers have turned on the news and there's been a top story about our servicemen and our servicewomen?
It's all about the celebrities nowadays, so yeah.
And so
it is.
And so there's a story to be told.
Right.
So not just for, our own troops and for internal communications, but for external communications. Yeah. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter about the person to your left and their right. It doesn't matter what their political beliefs are, their religious beliefs are. You're going to watch out for the person to your left and your right. Absolutely. And I think that there is a lot that we as a nation and we as a community of human beings can learn from what our men and women in uniform do day in and day out. So I felt it's important to tell their story, not just for historical purposes, but the world needs to know that our troops are the best trained, best equipped, best fighting force that this world has ever seen. And so to be able to document what was going on and to be able to share that with a very broad audience was a very personally rewarding experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things we all know about veterans is we tend to be, for the most part, humble and not wanting to talk about our stories. And we were at a Veterans Day breakfast a couple weeks ago, and Megan Michael spoke, and that was her message was, please tell your stories. If you don't tell your stories, they're going to be lost, and the next generation will never know. So I just think that's really a commendable and amazing gift that you have to help people tell their stories who probably wouldn't otherwise tell them. So is there a story that sticks out for you of all the stories you've told over the years?
Well, one thing that I really enjoyed and still talk about to this day was back in 2013, I was being promoted to Navy lieutenant. So for your viewers, a Navy lieutenant is like a captain in the Army or the Marine Corps or the Air Force. The seagoing services, lieutenants in 03. So I was intentionally looking for a World War II veteran to pin my rank. My grandfather served as a motor machinist mate during World War II. He passed away when I was in college. And I thought, here's an opportunity to, what I think is important for all of our veterans is to work toward bridging the generational gap.
Yes,
there are things that we can learn from these World War II vets, just like they can learn from us and all the generations in between. So I was intentional on seeking out a World War II vet. I called a gentleman by the name of Captain Dave Chilson, who passed away just a couple years ago. He was very involved in an organization known as Honor Flight. And I said, hey, Cap Chilson, this is who I am, and I'm looking for a World War II vet to promote me. He said, here's a guy I would recommend you reach out to. His name's Bob Barger. He lives over in Point Place. He was a naval aviator, served back during World War II. I said, okay, great. So I called Mr. Barger up out of the blue, and he said, come on over to my house. So I went over, we chatted, and a few weeks later, he drove over and administered, my oath and pinned my rank on, and we just kind of struck up a friendship that day. And I found out when he came back from his own time as a naval officer that he started going back to the university, wanted to pursue a degree, but he was married and had 2 daughters and had to withdraw from school because he needed to make ends meet for his family. So he never graduated. And I had pulled his transcripts from the university archives and was able to have those evaluated a few years ago. And he didn't have enough credits based on his academic course load at the time to graduate. Well, since then, they had created a new 2-year degree. And so I had his transcripts evaluated again. And lo and behold, he now had enough credits for this 2-year degree. So he became the oldest graduate of the university at 96 and a half years old.
Oh my gosh.
And just incredible.
Just to kind of be there with him and see that sense of accomplishment that he had in his eyes, just kind of the twinkle that he had sitting there. And when he was introduced and the crowd stood to their feet, 504 million people around the world heard his story. And for me, that just goes to show your story is never done being written until
Absolutely.
you want it to be done.
Absolutely.
And so he was an inspiration for me and an inspiration for countless of others around the world. So that's probably one of my favorite stories as far as kind of giving back and kind of bridging that generational gap. Probably looking back on the start of my time in the military, I had interviewed then candidate Bob Taft, who was running for governor.
Wow.
I was a high school senior, and I got an exclusive interview with him when he came to my high school, and he sent me an invitation to his inauguration. And so just walking around after the inaugural, I ran into an Army captain at the time, and we struck up a conversation. And 2 weeks later, a young Army sergeant by the name of Jerry Coleman, who went on to become a command sergeant major, came over to my parents' house and sat down, and I signed the papers, and January 29th of 1999 is when I enlisted. And so,
wow.
I kind of look back over that and understand that I firmly believe that things happen for a reason. And at the time, you may not understand kind of what the grand plan is for you. But after you kind of pass that time and you take time to look back, you can kind of start to see how some of those touch points were very intentional. So
it always comes together, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes, it does.
So it seems like you've done a lot in your career, and you've had a lot of opportunities with very high-level people. Are these opportunities where the doors were just kind of open for you, or do you feel like, is there anything specifically that you did to make that happen for you?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that oftentimes, when these kind of situations arise, I think that there's a lot of divine intervention there. I could tell you when I was growing up in middle school and high school, being the son of an immigrant, I got a lot of flack because my father was from Iran. And I never thought as a youngster that one day I would be traveling aboard Air Force One. I never thought that the President of the United States would summon me to the front of Air Force One, and not knowing what to talk with President Bush about, I said, hey, you mind if I share my favorite Bible scripture with you? I know that he credits the Lord with,
awesome.
Kind of getting his life back on track. And I know that he used to drink quite a bit, and he credits the Lord with turning his life around. And he kind of gave me this look like, yeah, sure. And so I share with him this verse out of Hebrews. It's 12:1, and it says to run with perseverance the race that's marked out for you. And he kind of gave me this look. He's like, he kind of bobbled his head a little bit, and he kind of chuckled. He said, kind of like that. Give me that one more time. so I told it to him again, and I remember just kind of, I was probably up there with him and his daughter Jenna and his photographer at the time, Eric Draper. I was probably up there for a good 10 minutes. There was no Secret Service in there. There were no aides in there. It was a very just kind of casual, heartfelt conversation. And I met him when he was running as the candidate, and he was a Republican candidate.
Wow.
And I was a young Army private and had the opportunity to meet him. And I thought, wow, here's quite possibly, going to be what I felt was my next commander-in-chief. And he ended up becoming that commander-in-chief. And there was a little video exchange of that. And I had given a copy of that to his photographer because his photographer, Eric, at the time was an AP photographer and pulled me aside and got my name and everything. And so he shows this video to the president on Air Force One, unbeknownst to me. And Eric comes to the back of the plane where the press corps sat, and he said, the president would like to see you up front. I said, what's going on? How's my hair look? I think he's like,
were you like freaking out inside?
I just kind of thought it was a joke, and he was just kind of, needling me a little bit.
Oh, man.
But next thing you know, they brought me to the front of the plane. And so it's times like that I can never say, hey, I want to do X, Y, and Z. I kind of take it day by day as it comes. Obviously, everyone has some goals in their lives, but if you would have asked me back in, the early 2000s or the middle 2000s when I left the Army, when I was honorably discharged and said, okay, that chapter of my life is done, I never would have thought, here in 2018, I'd be Lieutenant Commander of the United States Navy. I would have deployed to Afghanistan. All these kind of things would have, would have happened. But again, looking back on it, you see those kind of different touch points, and you see how, a conversation with, a friend of mine by the name of Chad McNeely, who was a photographer for Secretary Rumsfeld and for Admiral Mullen, and then when Admiral Mullen became the Joint Chiefs, and we had a great friendship and a conversation at BW3s one day following a Washington Nationals baseball game led to a conversation with then Captain John Kirby, who went on to retire as an admiral, and Captain John Kirby at the time recommended me for direct commission. So I never would have thought that these things would have happened. It wasn't on my kind of bucket list to get back in and serve, but I'm very grateful that conversation happened and that I've had the opportunity to continue to serve my community, my state, my nation.
Love it. That's just fantastic.
This is great to hear.
So if you reflect back on that time where you had just gotten out of the Army and you were feeling lost, we know that there's a lot of veterans out there today that have just ended their service, whether it's retirement or some other life circumstance. Is there any words of wisdom that you could share with someone when you think about what it was like for you and all the
Sure.
things that you've continued to do and the ways that you've continued to serve beyond that?
So there's a couple differences that I think are important to identify about my time in Bosnia. So Bosnia was essentially a peacekeeping mission. I mean, obviously it took on a new context because, as I said, we were getting our cold weather gear when the plane struck the towers, and so it did change a little bit. Afghanistan, places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and places that we don't even read about or hear about in the news because of the classification of those missions, those are kinetic operations. Those are bombs and bullets and your battle buddies being injured and killed. I often try to encourage folks to, probably the simplest thing someone can do is invest in a small cup of black coffee or a tea or a can of pop and just say, hey, let's chat. Tell me about your story. The thing that I've noticed when doing that is that it helps that veteran kind of open up, and maybe there's a weight that has been on their shoulders and they feel, maybe someone's going to judge me because I've served, or someone's going to maybe look differently at me because I might have an invisible wound like post-traumatic stress. These are wounds that you can't just look at someone and see. And so I've always found that having those conversations has just been an opportunity for that veteran to open up and share maybe a little bit or maybe a lot, or some of the struggles. And our veterans, in my perception, oftentimes are not looking for a handout. Simply, they just may need a hand up. Just someone to come alongside them and say, you know what, I've been there. I can relate to you. Here's some of the things that worked for me. Here's some of the things that maybe didn't work for me. And at the end of the day, it's really up to that veteran to decide which tool he or she wants to put in their toolbox.
Absolutely.
So they may get a piece of advice from you and they're like, hey, that's great. And one from you, and that's great. And they may look at me and say, you know what, that's a great piece of advice, but it might not work for me. And so they take that tool, maybe they put it on another shelf for another time. But there's things that I believe, as long as conversations are had, that we can continue to help each other. I'll give you another example. There's a Vietnam vet that came to me. He's been struggling with post-traumatic stress for a long time. And as a result of that, this veteran ended up suing the VA for the challenges that he had getting his diagnosis. And his case went all the way to the court of, the Veterans Court in DC, which is kind of like, I kind of described it as like the Supreme Court for veterans cases. This is like
Veterans Appeals,
the definitive answer on these kind of cases. And his case went all the way up. And he won his case. But in the meantime, it took a toll on his family. His wife left him. He's kind of estranged from the kids. And this gentleman came to me one day, and after we had kind of become friends, and he said, what's going to happen to me when I die? I said, well, what do you mean by that? He was like, who's going to take care of me and like my stuff and whatnot? And so after a conversation, when he passes, I'm taking him to Arlington. Okay.
Wow.
And so here was a conversation that if I would have just kind of had a wall put up and he would have had a wall put up, we wouldn't have developed that friendship. Here's someone that is in their late 60s, maybe even early 70s, that I worked with him. He now has a therapy dog. He's opened up about some of the struggles that he had when he was in the military. And that is kind of a very small example of the kind of greater impact that everyday Americans can have in the lives of veterans, that are in their community. Because at the end of the day, I mean, you never know who's the veteran. Is it the person you're at church worshiping with, or your place of worship, if you go somewhere to worship? Is it the person that's bagging your groceries at the grocery store? Is it someone at the bank? Is it someone that, you go to school with or just see out in the community? Obviously, there's some things that give indication that maybe you served in the military. But sometimes some folks just want that to be another chapter of their life, and they don't want to talk about it. So they shelter kind of some of those struggles, and if we can have those conversations, as Commander Michael was saying, tell those stories, it is the opportunity to be impactful in ways that we may never fully grasp.
Absolutely.
I know for me, it's been, I've always looked at it like, you got the most important 2 dates in your life, when you're born and when you die. But it's even more important, what are you going to do with the dash in between, And I think it's so impactful when you can have, such an impact on, when you've been helped, as I've been helped through Who's myself, to give back to those veterans that are in need, and just to see what it is you can do for them. And it's been amazing, even here with different veterans that we've had come through. So I'm honored to hear what you're doing for others.
Yeah.
It's great to hear.
And that was a great segue, your last answer, into the final question I had for you, which was to the community, to the people who are not veterans, to the people who really can't ever understand. Do you have any guidance on a better way to approach veterans, to lend an ear, especially if they want to close that chapter, which, I don't think anyone really wants to close that chapter unless they've got some ill feelings around it, and sometimes even just talking about the ill feelings. So is there any advice that you have, or any ways that you can recommend family members or friends go about approaching that veteran at church or the grocery line that won't shut them down?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that service takes on many different uniforms. Service is not just service in the military. We have first responders, we have nurses, we have teachers, we have pastors and rabbis and folks in the that are helping people in their spiritual journey. So service really kind of takes on lots of different identities. For those folks that have served in the military, I think it's important to, first and foremost, not to indicate that you understand when maybe you haven't had those experiences. Kind of looking back on it, so we have 2 young children at home, and I remember when I came back from Afghanistan, my wife was always like, why do you feel comfortable talking to the neighbors about X, Y, and Z, but you don't want to talk to me about it? Well, the neighbors are in the military.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as much as I know that my wife loves me and supports me and wants to help me kind of get through some of those times of where have I been, where am I going, and how am I going to get there, until she's been there, she's not going to fully grasp it. And I think it finally hit me after the birth of our daughter, and I thought, why is she telling all these moms this stuff? Like, she should be like relying on me. I'm her husband. Yeah. But then I started to think, like, as much as I love my wife and appreciate what my wife does every day and understands that bringing a child into this world is probably the absolute biggest responsibility as a mother that she will ever have. Mm-hmm. I will never fully grasp that because I will never be in my wife's shoes. Mm. And so trying to find ways in which you can relate and understand, I think, is key. But I also believe it's key not to say you understand or be dismissive or just kind of take it kind of tongue-in-cheek what they're saying. There's a Vietnam vet that grew up outside of Cleveland, Ohio, that was injured in Vietnam, was on his deathbed. The pastor came in and gave him his kind of last rites. They pinned a Purple Heart on his bed sheet because he was so badly injured they couldn't affix it to a uniform or anything, just kind of pinned it on the bed sheet. Mm-hmm. Shortly after that, his father died. His medical condition started to improve enough that they were able to bring him out of Vietnam to come home for his father's funeral. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to send him back to Vietnam. And the late Senator Ted Kennedy and some others are like, no, he's going to stay here and he's going to recover here in Massachusetts. But he never, all these years, talked about his time in Vietnam and what had happened. Part of that was because that Purple Heart had been lost somewhere. And they wrote off for help. And for whatever reason, no one was able to get this Purple Heart reissued and presented to him, and so on and so forth. And his sister's telling me the story, so I ended up making a couple phone calls, and within about a week, I get his Purple Heart issued. And to this day, he's now opened up about that because he feels like, okay, people appreciate my service and sacrifice.
Wow.
So you look back on folks from, Vietnam, for example, that were never given their proper welcome home. I always ask myself, how different would the lives of these women and these men be if when they came back home,
yes,
our fellow citizens welcomed them home?
Right.
They never did that. And so as that that generation, that pledge that there would never be another generation of veterans to go through what they've gone through. And so having those conversations and having a listening ear and a sympathetic heart, I think is key. And then just kind of seeing where it goes from there. Maybe they want to open up, maybe they don't want to open up, but understanding that someone is willing to listen about your service and your struggles without passing judgment, one day that veteran will likely open up.
Right. And
that may be the day that changes their life. That may be the day that says, you know what, my life is worth living. That may be the day that says, I'm turning a new leaf and I'm going to come back and invest in my community. Probably the last thing I would just say is this. This past week, President George H.W. Bush passed away. And listening to the eulogies of his life, from the time he was a youngster to the time he enlisted as one of the youngest naval aviators ever, to being shot down, to being rescued, to losing his men that day, to going on and coming back and starting a family, and then the loss of his daughter at 3 years old, and just kind of the places that he was put in throughout his life to give back to his community was just so reassuring to know that every day there are men and women answering our nation's call to service, and they come back home. For some of them, there's a time of struggle. For some of them, it's more of a seamless transition. But no matter what their storyline is, they're coming back, and every one of them is continuing their service in one way or another. It's to their family, it's to their community, it's to their friends, it's to their fellow servicemen and women. And just taking the time to listen about George H.W. Bush's lifetime of service to others, I think is something that can definitely serve as an inspiration, not just now, but for generations to come.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been just amazing. And thank you for everything that you've done for our country, our veterans, all the things you continue to do. If someone wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way? Do you have an email?
So probably the best way to get a hold of me is just through my email. Probably the simplest one is just Haraz, which is Haraz, the @ me.com. That's the old school Apple emails when they first came out back in the day. I still have that one. So they can always reach out to me that way, or they can get a hold of me either through my city council email or my city council phone number as well.
Haraz, thank you so much for joining us. This has been incredible, very impactful. Thank you for your service. Thank you for the ways that you continue to serve.
Well, I appreciate both of you having me, and good luck with your continued opportunities to be impactful in the lives of our fellow veterans.
All right, well, thank you. And if you liked what you saw today, please like, share, and comment below, and subscribe. And until next time, this has been Service After Sacrifice.